The chair they gave me was beside the coatroom. Not near it. Beside it, close enough that every 20 minutes someone would lean past my shoulder to hand off a wool blazer or ask if I had a ticket stub. The folding table they'd set up for me held a small vase of carnations, the kind you buy at a gas station, not the ranunculus that covered every other surface in that hall. I noticed the difference immediately. I notice most things, after 63 years of paying attention to what people think you won't see. My daughter-in-law's family had rented the Rosewater Ballroom in downtown Toronto for the occasion. It was the kind of venue where the chandeliers were original and the staff wore earpieces. The kind of place where someone had spent months coordinating the exact shade of ivory on the chair sashes. My son, Patrick, had told me the venue deposit alone was $60,000. He said it like a confession. He said it like he wanted me to understand something without having to say it plainly. I understood. I had driven 4 hours from Sudbury. I'd pressed my navy dress twice the night before because the iron I own leaves a faint ridge if you rush it, and I didn't want to look like I'd rushed. I'd had my hair done at the salon on Elm Street where Donna has cut it for 11 years, and I wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, Iris, who died the spring Patrick turned 9. I had wanted to look appropriate. I had wanted, if I'm being truthful, to not give anyone a reason. I gave them one anyway, apparently. My reason was that I existed. Patrick had married Sandra 18 months ago in a small civil ceremony, just the two of them and 2 witnesses, a choice I supported completely. This party was different. This was Sandra's mother, Vivienne, throwing what she called a proper celebration for the couple now that they'd settled into their new home in Forest Hill. It was, in every visible way, a party for Vivienne herself. The guest list was 200 people, most of whom worked in Vivienne's industry or moved in her social circle. Sandra was a tax lawyer. Vivienne was a retired judge. Their family had a kind of wealth that didn't announce itself loudly, it just quietly excluded everyone who didn't share it. I am a retired school librarian. I live in a 3-bedroom house that I own outright, which I'm proud of, but which is not in Forest Hill. I drove a 2014 Civic to that party and self-parked because the valet prices at Rosewater are $12, and I saw no reason. When I arrived, a young woman with a clipboard greeted me near the entrance. She had the particular smile of someone doing a job that requires warmth they don't genuinely feel. She scanned her list, found my name, or what I assume was my name, because she paused half a beat too long before she found it, and said, with perfect pleasantness, "We've placed you at table 11, near the west alcove. The quiet corner, perfect for guests who'd like to step back from the noise a little." She said it like a courtesy. She meant it as an assignment. I followed the young man who led me to table 11, past the main floor where the round tables were draped in ivory and gold, past the raised platform where Vivienne was already holding court in a gown the color of champagne, past Patrick and Sandra, greeting guests near the entrance to the main hall. Patrick saw me. He raised his hand in a wave. Sandra touched his elbow and said something I didn't hear, and he turned back to the guests in front of him. Table 11 was in the west alcove. The west alcove was where the coatroom was, and where the catering staff moved in and out through a swing door that opened every 4 minutes I counted. Later, because I had time. There were 4 other people at table 11. An elderly great-uncle of Sandra's who was hard of hearing and fell asleep before the appetizers arrived, a young cousin who spent the evening on her phone, and 2 seats that remained empty all night. I sat down. I placed my small clutch on the table. I straightened the carnations. I am 63 years old, and I have lived long enough to know the difference between a slight you imagined and one delivered with perfect, deliberate care. This was the latter. I had raised Patrick alone from the time he was 11, after his father Gerald left. I had worked full-time at the school board, driven him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning, helped him with university applications at the kitchen table until past midnight, and attended every graduation with the same pride I feel for every good thing he has ever done. I had never asked him to choose. I had never made demands about his wife, his home, his money, or his time. I had simply loved him without conditions and assumed incorrectly it seemed that this meant I would be seated somewhere near him when his family threw a party in his honor. I was thinking about all of this, not with bitterness but with the particular clarity that comes when you've stopped trying to explain yourself. When the swing door beside me opened and 2 catering staff stepped out carrying trays. Then, a few seconds later, I heard footsteps that moved differently, not with the quick efficiency of someone working, but with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. A man sat down across from me at table 11. He was perhaps 65, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing in front of people who are listening to you. He wore a charcoal suit and no tie. He set his glass of sparkling water on the table and looked around the alcove with the calm expression of someone who finds everything faintly interesting. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at the sleeping great-uncle. He looked at the carnations. Then he looked at me with an expression that held no pity, just recognition, the kind that passes between people who have both seen the same thing and don't need to pretend otherwise. "Well," he said quietly, "they've certainly put the interesting people in the back." I looked at him. "You know where the interesting people are kept?" "I have some experience being placed inconveniently," he said. He extended his hand across the table. "Gareth Sinclair, Dorothy Fleming," I said, "mother of the groom." He didn't flinch and didn't offer sympathy. He simply nodded, as if this explained the carnations and the alcove and the folding table and everything else, and said, "Tell me about yourself, Dorothy Fleming." I almost said, "Oh, there isn't much." I have said that reflexively for 20 years, the way women my age were taught to do, to minimize, to take up less space, to smile and redirect. Instead, I heard myself say, I spent 31 years helping children find the books that changed their lives. I think that matters more than most things. Gareth Sinclair looked at me steadily and said, "I think you're right." We talked through the appetizer course. He was from Vancouver originally, now lived in Ottawa. He had been a professor of constitutional law at the University of Ottawa for nearly 30 years, before moving into something he described vaguely as advisory work. He asked questions the way people do when they're genuinely curious follow-up questions, specific questions, questions that showed he'd listened to the previous answer. He asked about Sudbury, about the library, about the students I remembered best. I asked about his work, about Vancouver, about whether he missed the mountains. We were, I realized, having an exceptionally good conversation at a party where neither of us was supposed to matter. Approximately 40 minutes into the evening, I became aware of a shift in energy near the main floor. The kind of shift you feel before you see it, a slight change in the movement of people, a clustering, a stillness. I looked up from our conversation and saw Vivienne moving through the room with the directional focus of someone who has identified a problem. She was a tall woman, Vivienne. Composed, always composed. I'd met her twice before this evening, and she moved through every room like she was the one who had signed the lease on it. She was wearing the champagne gown and a necklace that I suspected was real and not sentimental. She walked toward the west alcove with a smile that said this was a social call, and eyes that said it was not. She stopped at table 11. She looked at Gareth, then at me, then at Gareth again. "I wasn't expecting to see you in this corner," she said to him. Her voice was perfectly pleasant, which meant nothing. "Perfectly comfortable corner," Gareth said. He didn't stand. He picked up his water glass. Vivienne's smile held. "We have a seat for you at the main table, of course. I should have made sure you were directed properly when you arrived. My apologies." She glanced briefly at me the way you glance at furniture. "Dorothy, isn't it? Patrick's mother?" I said. "Yes, of course." A fraction of a pause. "Patrick mentioned you'd driven in from Sudbury," I said. "Of course." She turned back to Gareth. "Please, come join us. I know Chancellor Abbott has been hoping to speak with you." Gareth set his glass down. He looked at me. He looked at Vivienne. He said, in the same unhurried voice he'd used to ask me about my favorite reference books, "Dorothy and I were in the middle of something. I'll come find you later, Vivienne." The pause that followed was brief enough that most people wouldn't have called it a pause. I would. I have 31 years of reading rooms, and I know what a recalculation looks like. Vivienne said, smoothly, Of course. Whenever you're ready. She turned and walked back toward the main floor, and I noticed that she walked slightly faster on the return than she had on the approach. I looked at Gareth. I said, "You don't have to stay." He said, "I'm aware." There was a commotion of sorts, just after the main course. I didn't see the beginning of it, but I saw Patrick moving through the room with the expression he has worn since he was a teenager when something is wrong, jaw forward, eyes tracking. He was moving toward the west alcove, toward me, but he stopped halfway when he was intercepted by Sandra and one of her cousins and redirected back to the main floor. He looked over his shoulder once. I lifted my hand. He looked away. I had been living with that expression for long enough not to be wounded by it. Hurt, yes. Wounded, no. The difference is that wounds are damage. This was something else, the particular sadness of watching someone you love choose the easier thing, repeatedly, and knowing that one day the easier thing will cost them more than they planned. It was Sandra's younger sister, Kelsey, who came to the alcove next. Kelsey was in her late 30s, sharp in the way of someone who has grown up watching a very smart woman operate and absorbed about 70% of it. She sat down in one of the empty chairs without asking, looked at Gareth with recognition, and looked at me with something I hadn't expected, a faint embarrassment that was almost apology. She said, "I just want you to know I had nothing to do with the seating." I said, "I believe you." She said, "My mother can be," and then stopped, and appeared to weigh several words before settling on particular. I said, "I know the type." Gareth had turned slightly to give us a degree of privacy. He was watching the main floor with the same calm expression he'd turned on everything else that evening, not disengaged, just patient. Kelsey said, quietly, "For what it's worth, Patrick talks about you all the time. He talks about how you raised him, about the house in Sudbury, about the library. He's proud of you. He just gets—" She stopped again. "He gets turned around sometimes." I said, "I know." And I did. I'd watched him get turned around since he was 12 years old, navigating a world that had more money and more certainty than we did. He'd always wanted to belong to those rooms. I had never blamed him for it. I had only hoped that belonging to them wouldn't cost him himself. "He should come say that to her himself," Gareth said, quietly, without turning from the main floor. Kelsey looked at him. Then she nodded and got up and went back to the main floor. 15 minutes later, Patrick came to the alcove alone. He sat down in the chair Kelsey had just vacated. He was 41 years old, and at that moment, he looked much younger the way people look when they're about to say something that has been true for a long time. He looked at me, and he didn't look at Gareth, though he knew Gareth was there. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "The seating was, I should have looked at it. I should have." I said, "Patrick," I waited until he was looking at me directly. "I'm not angry. I want you to hear that. But I need you to understand something. I kept my voice even. I've had 31 years of keeping my voice even in moments that mattered. I drove 4 hours. I wore my mother's earrings. I came because I love you, not because I needed to be seen, not because I wanted anything from tonight. But when you seat your mother next to the Coatroom and don't come to check on her for 40 minutes, you are telling her something. You may not have meant to say it, but you said it." Patrick was quiet for a long time. He said, "I hear you." He said, "I'm going to do better." I looked at my son, this person I had made and fed and frightened for and hoped for across 41 years, and I thought, I believe you. Not because the believing was easy, but because there is no alternative to believing the people you love are capable of growing. The moment you stop believing it, you've given up on them. And I was not ready to give up on Patrick. I said, "Good." He looked at Gareth for the first time. There was a pause. Gareth said, simply, "Your mother is remarkable company." Patrick said, "I know." His voice cracked slightly on the second word. He covered it with a cough and looked at the ceiling. "I know she is." Patrick went back to the party. He stopped at his wife's side and said something to her that I couldn't hear, but I watched Sandra's posture change in the way postures change when someone who normally defers decides not to. I watched him say it twice. I watched Sandra look toward the alcove, briefly, and then look away. At the end of the evening, after the speeches and the cake and the inevitable group photographs, I gathered my clutch and my jacket and stood up. My knees, which are not what they were at 40, reminded me of the 4-hour drive waiting for me. Gareth stood at the same moment, and we walked toward the exit together without discussing it. In the lobby, near the coat check, he stopped. He said, "I'll be at the Ottawa Public Library in 6 weeks. They're hosting a panel on public access to legal resources, which is more interesting than it sounds. I'd like to buy you dinner if you're ever in the city." I said, 6 weeks is a long time to plan ahead. He said, "I'm a careful planner." I said, "I'll think about it." I meant yes. I think he knew I meant yes. I drove back to Sudbury that night because I sleep better in my own bed. I had the highway mostly to myself after Kingston, and somewhere around the Parry Sound Junction I turned off the radio and drove in silence. Not the silence of someone processing hurt, but the kind of silence that comes when something has shifted and you're still getting used to the new arrangement of things. I thought about my mother's earrings. I thought about Patrick's face when his voice cracked. I thought about 31 years of putting books in the hands of children who needed them, and how that work would never have a seat at a Rosewater ballroom table, and how that was genuinely fine, because the Rosewater ballroom table was not where the interesting things happened. The interesting things, as it turned out, happened at table 11. I arrived home at 2 in the morning. I made tea. I took off my mother's earrings and set them in the small dish on my dresser where they always go. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, and I thought about what Kelsey had said. He talks about you all the time, and I let that be true. I let it count. I let it sit beside the coatroom and the carnations and the swing door and still count. In the weeks that followed, Patrick called more. Not dramatically more. He was not a man for dramatic gestures, and I hadn't asked for one. But he called. He asked about the library where I now volunteer on Tuesdays. He asked about Donna, and about the Civic, and about whether I'd had the eaves cleaned like I'd mentioned needing to do in September. He asked the questions of someone who is trying to pay attention, and I answered them as the person I have always been, a woman who is not interested in being thanked for the ordinary work of love, but who notices, always, when that love is returned. Sandra called once, about 3 weeks after the party. The call lasted 6 minutes. She was polite in the careful way of someone who has been told to be polite but hasn't quite arrived at genuine. I was gracious, because grace is not the same as forgiveness, and I can offer the first while still holding space for the second to come in its own time. We spoke about their kitchen renovation, and about Patrick's new running habit, and about nothing that mattered and everything that was a beginning. It is enough, for now, to be a beginning. 6 weeks after the party, I drove to Ottawa. I will not say it was entirely because of the dinner invitation. I had colleagues I'd been meaning to visit and a conference at Library Archives Canada I'd registered for in the fall, but I did have dinner. We sat for 3 hours at a small Italian place near the Byward Market and talked about constitutional history and about Northern Ontario winters and about the particular pleasure of spending your life around books and the people who need them. Gareth was, as I had suspected at table 11, excellent company. I drove home the next afternoon with the windows down despite the November chill, which is something I haven't done in years. The cold air through the open window felt like something I had chosen, which is perhaps the best thing any feeling can be. I have thought often, in the times since, about what we teach people by how we absorb their treatment of us. When I sat quietly at table 11, I was not being a doormat. I want to be clear about that, and I hope any woman reading this understands the difference. I was observing. I was waiting. I was deciding what kind of person I intended to be in response to what was happening, because that decision belongs to no one but me. The table they assigned me did not determine my value. I arrived at that party already knowing what I was worth, and no seating chart in any ballroom in Toronto had the authority to revise it. What I have learned, at 63, is that the people who diminish you are almost always working from fear. Vivian placed me near the coatroom because she was afraid of what I represented, a different kind of life that had produced a person her daughter loved. People who are secure do not need to manage the seating of a librarian from Sudbury. Only people who are frightened of something do that. And what I have learned about the people we love, the Patricks of our lives, the ones who get turned around, the ones who wave from across a room and get redirected by their elbows, is that love does not mean waiting indefinitely with no expectations. It means saying clearly, I drove 4 hours, I wore my mother's earrings, I deserve better than this, and then waiting to see if the person you love is brave enough to hear you. Patrick is trying to be brave enough. I believe in the trying. I kept the carnations, by the way. I had put them in the passenger seat of the Civic when I left. I wasn't sure why at the time. They lived on my kitchen table for 5 days before they turned, which is actually longer than you'd expect from gas station carnations. I think about that sometimes when I'm making tea. Things placed in the wrong conditions lasting longer than they were supposed to. Persisting. Blooming quietly in the front seat all the way back up the highway, through Perry Sound and Sudbury, still going. You don't need the main table to belong at the party. You need to know who you are before you walk in the door. Bring that knowledge with you like your mother's earrings, not as armor, but as memory, as inheritance, as the thing that no one's seating chart can touch. Your seat was never the point. You were.